the exam. It's an important one to understand. So I just want to make sure that we go through that briefly before we move on to the last 10,000 years. All right, so let's pull it up here. Okay, so modern human origins. So there's two what we call classic models. So the classic hypotheses, these have definitely been points of contention for anthropology departments for the last 50 to 60 years. When I was in your guys' position as an undergrad, even as a grad student, my professors and those that I looked up to learn these models from, they of course had disagreements on it. So that's why sometimes it's a difficult concept to fully understand, because there is so much contention and so much disagreement on which model is correct. But in reality, the more we're learning, especially what we're learning with modern genetics, as we're doing studies that can actually extract DNA from Neanderthal remains and possibly with Homo naledi, there's, Lieberger and John Hawkes have hinted towards the possibility that they may be able to extract DNA from some of the fossils that were uncovered at the Rising Star Chamber. So, of course, these two classic hypotheses, neither one of them may be fully correct. But it is still important to examine the historical hypotheses and how they still apply. So let's talk about what they are first. So out of Africa, or also sometimes called out of Africa 2, is basically stating that modern Homo sapiens evolved in the continent of Africa and then spread to Asia and Europe, where modern humans gradually replaced any other hominid population that they encountered. So you can also think of this as the complete and total replacement model. So this model states that Homo sapiens originated in Africa 200 to 300,000 years ago. They left the continent of Africa, migrated to the rest of the old world, which is Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. What we know of today is Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And once they encountered other species like the Neanderthals or Heidelbergensis or Homo floresiensis, that essentially they outcompeted and outbred any other species that they encountered. So those who ascribe to the classic out of Africa model believe that Homo sapiens are a completely distinct, separate biological species from every other species. So they're a separate species from Neanderthals, they're a separate species from Homo heidelbergensis, or any other possibility that's out there. So those that ascribe to this model believe that Neanderthals were essentially an evolutionary dead end, that they were essentially outcompeted and outbred by Homo sapiens, and they do not leave any genetic descendants in our gene pool. Okay, so that's the classic out of Africa. So the classic out of Africa doesn't leave a whole lot of room for the possibility that any of these hominins interbred, at least when we're talking about the origins of Homo sapiens. So you can also think of out of Africa as the classic replacement model, where Homo sapiens wiped out, outcompeted, outbred any other hominin that they encountered. The other kind of what we call classic model is what we call the multi-regional continuity model. So this model states essentially that the shift to modern humans took place regionally and did not involve complete replacement. So essentially this one states that Homo erectus left Africa approximately 1.8 million years ago, spread across the rest of the old world, and then that transition to modern, anatomically modern Homo sapiens took place gradually and regionally, and involved a lot of interbreeding, a lot of admixture of genes, a lot of gene flow. So essentially that transition to modern Homo sapiens took place regionally and did not involve complete replacement, okay? So you could also think of the multi-regional model as basically the gene flow or the admixture model. So they're kind of opposites of one another in the sense that out of Africa is more of a replacement model, more of a, Homo sapiens wiped everybody else out kind of model, whereas a multi-regional continuity model leaves more possibility for the fact that, multiple species, multiple hominin species contributed to our modern day gene pool. All right, so this is just kind of a visualization. This one will help you visualize how these two models are related. So it's just, kind of putting into a diagram what I discussed here, the out of Africa versus multi-regional. So the out of Africa that's here on the left-hand side, looking at Homo ergaster, and then this model looks at Homo erectus as kind of an evolutionary offshoot that was essentially a dead end. So ergaster originally originated in Africa about 1.8 million years ago. And then Heidelbergensis, we find Heidelbergensis in both Africa, Europe, and Asia. So heidelbergensis, those that subscribe to the out of Africa model, they believe that Homo heidelbergensis is the common ancestor of both Homo neanderthalensis, or the Neanderthals, and us, Homo sapiens. So they believe that the split happened somewhere between about 800,000 to 500,000 years ago. So one split off into the Neanderthals, one split off into Homo sapiens. So those that ascribe to the out of Africa model essentially believe that Homo neanderthalensis is a completely separate biological species and did not contribute anything to our modern day gene pool. So they were essentially an evolutionary dead end, and that Homo sapiens, they are the only species left. So essentially they outcompeted and outbred any other species that they encountered. So again, out of Africa can also be looked at as a replacement model. Doesn't leave a whole lot of room for the possibility of any degree of interbreeding between species. All right, and then the other model, the other classic one, is called the multi-regional continuity model. So you see all of these arrows in this diagram, they are all representing admixture of genes, gene flow, admixture of genes, interbreeding events. So those that ascribe to this model look at Homo erectus leaving Africa about 1.8 million years ago. And then as they spread across the globe, as they spread to Europe, the Middle East, to Asia, to Indonesia, you guys get the picture. As they spread across the globe, they interbred, swapped genes, and a lot of admixture occurred. So another way of looking at the multi-regional continuity model is the gene flow model. It's leaving a lot of room for the possibility that there was quite a bit of swapping of genes over the last 2 million years, essentially, but especially over the last 800,000 years. And then essentially the transition to modern Homo sapiens took place regionally and did not involve complete replacement. All right, so then the recognition, or the fact that neither one of those models really fully explains modern human origins was made pretty apparent after the Neanderthal genome study that was done in 2010. I mean, of course, there was contention and disagreement about it well before that study was published. It's been going on for over 50 years. But it really, the publishing, or when that study came out, that really did throw a wrench in both models, to be honest. Because the realization that there was at least some degree of interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens really certainly kind of threw out that classic out of Africa model, because that classic out of Africa model really didn't leave any room for interbreeding, really stated that Neanderthals were an evolutionary dead end, essentially, and that essentially modern Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had to be completely separate biological species, that they were not capable of interbreeding and producing viable fertile offspring. So the publishment of the 2010 Neanderthal genome study really kind of threw a serious wrench, or at least created a problem for that classic out of Africa model. The multi-regional model also has a lot of problems, essentially, because there's a lot of evidence that, anatomically speaking, that Homo sapiens did in fact originate almost exclusively in Africa. Now, it's not saying that they didn't migrate out possibly sooner than we know, and that there was quite a bit of admixture of genes, but there is quite a bit of anatomical, paleontological, even behavioral evidence that Homo sapiens originated in Africa. So this model does agree, the assimilation model agrees that Homo sapiens originated in Africa. So they agree with out of Africa in that particular point. But where they disagree with the classic out of Africa model is those that ascribe to the assimilation model believe that once Homo sapiens migrated out, that they interbred with other hominin species that they encountered, such as Homo neanderthalensis. So this model suggests that the current models do not adequately explain modern human origins. And it is certainly supported by the Neanderthal genome study that was published in 2010, and the fact that there were a variety of hominin species present the last 300,000 years of human evolution. So the Neanderthals were present, Homo sapiens were present, Homo heidelbergensis was present, possibly Homo antecessor, possibly Homo naledi, Homo floresiensis. So even based on the evidence we have thus far, there was a handful of hominin species that were present over the last 300,000 years. And now there's quite a bit of evidence that, at least with the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, there was quite a bit of swapping of genes, quite a bit of admixture of genes and gene flow. So those that ascribe to the assimilation model essentially believe that Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens are not completely separate biological species, that Neanderthals are simply a geographical variant or subspecies of Homo sapiens. Now, sub doesn't mean less. It just means the word subspecies, it's just a classification term. It just means that they are a geographical variant of the overarching Homo sapiens species, okay? So essentially, it's calling into question as well something that we talked about way back in chapter 4. So chapter 4 was all about the forces of evolution and all about the biological species concept. What are the qualifiers for a species? You know, what happens when there's gene flow? What happens when there's genetic bottlenecking? What happens with natural selection and mutation? So this completely understanding these models does require that you do a little bit of a recall. So if this sounds unfamiliar, I do recommend you kind of go back and either watch the lecture from chapter 4 or read the chapter, whatever method you prefer, because it does require some degree of understanding and recall of those concepts. Because if this is in fact correct, it certainly does call into question whether or not we can consider Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis completely separate biological species. Because if they were in fact interbreeding and producing viable fertile offspring, then they're the same species, at least if we're ascribing to the classic biological species definition. Because the biological species definition, at least where it is currently, states that if two individuals can breed with one another and produce viable fertile offspring, so meaning that their offspring are not only can they survive, but they can also reproduce again. They can create another generation. So that was certainly, at least according to the Neanderthal genome studies that have been done to date, there's quite a bit of evidence that that was happening, at least in a handful of situations. Okay, so that's kind of a quick breakdown of the three models, the three big models that are out there: out of Africa versus multi-regional versus the more current one, which is the assimilation model. So I know you guys already, hopefully watch this when you watch my recording of this lecture, in place of our class on Monday. But I did want to make sure that I at least went over that point, because I know it is something that definitely comes up in your discussions and in the exam, and it's important to understand. So do you guys have questions on that before I move on to the last 10,000 years? Okay, and just for my own organization, I'm going to stop the recording for a second and then restart it, just to keep it a little bit more organized. So you guys will know that's something that is related to